I was an affair baby and lived a life of emotional neglect now. After years of low contact, my father's family is reaching out to reconnect, but I'm not sure it's what I want. My name is Rachel, I'm 34, and lately, I found myself in a situation that has me questioning everything. If I'm honest, I feel more skeptical than I've been in years. To give you some context, I'm what people might call an affair baby. Unfortunately, that didn't lead to me being cherished by two loving families. Instead, it left me caught between two emotionally distant and resentful ones. My entire life, I've felt like an outsider, a mistake everyone wanted to ignore rather than embrace. Growing up, my half-siblings barely acknowledged my existence. I was the shadow they conveniently forgot in family pictures and gatherings. My step-parents? They made it painfully clear I was more of a nuisance than a child they had any interest in. But the worst part was my own biological parents, my mother and father, who treated me not like their daughter, but like a burden, a constant reminder of their past mistakes. To them, I was their punishment, not someone to love or nurture. When I turned 18, I packed my bags and left my hometown in Nebraska without a second thought. I headed to college in Missouri and never looked back. It wasn't just the geographical distance I wanted, I needed to escape the weight of their indifference, their judgment, and their constant scorn. While I was in college, I discovered just how deep the betrayal from my so-called family went. My stepfather, Frank, had opened not one but two credit cards in my name. He maxed them out, didn't bother paying them off, and eventually defaulted on both accounts. When I found out, I was livid. I pursued legal action, and he was convicted of identity theft. He spent 2 years in prison for what he did. That entire ordeal severed any remaining ties I had with my mother's side of the family, the Whitmores. After his conviction, there was an awkward confrontation with them, but since then, they've stayed completely out of my life. Honestly? Good riddance. Not a single one of them has reached out in the 13 years since, and I can't say I miss them. In the years following, I poured myself into my goals and ambitions. I worked tirelessly, and I'm proud to say I've achieved so much. Becoming a plastic surgeon had always been my dream, and now, it's my reality. Sure, a lot of my work involves the usual noses, breasts, and the like, but I also get to help people in profound ways. Reconstructing faces for accident victims, giving breast cancer survivors a sense of wholeness again, repairing cleft palates, it's incredibly fulfilling. My career is thriving, and I've built a good life for myself. But while I cut off the Whitmores completely, my father's side, the Freemans, hasn't been much better. I've only had minimal contact with them over the past 13 years. Back when I was pursuing charges against Frank for identity theft, my stepmother, Linda, surprised me by being supportive and encouraging. For once, she seemed genuinely nice, a stark contrast to how she'd treated me my whole life. My dad, Bill, also called me more frequently during that time, and for a brief moment, I thought maybe he actually cared. I let myself believe that he might be interested in having a real relationship with me. But as soon as the case was over, the calls stopped, and the support evaporated. It was back to the same old silence. That was the last straw for me. After that, I stopped making any effort with the Freemans. Occasionally, I'd get a wedding announcement or a birth announcement in the mail, but those felt more like obligatory updates than genuine attempts to include me. Then, when word got out that I was doing well financially, the invites started rolling in actual invitations to weddings and family events. Funny, isn't it? All those years, they couldn't be bothered to include me, but now that they think I have money, suddenly I'm worth an invitation. For a while, I'd send a congratulatory card or a small gift for the announcements, but as I grew older and wiser, I realized the truth. They never really wanted me in the family. Now that I was successful, they saw me as someone who could be useful. I decided I wouldn't play into their shallow games. For the last 3 years, I haven't responded to a single card, message, or invitation. That brings me to 6 months ago, when something unexpected happened. I got an email from my father. In it, he apologized for not being there enough when I was growing up. To say it was an understatement is putting it mildly, but I have to admit, it was a start. The email was long, filled with updates about his life, Linda, and my 2 older brothers, Mike and Matt. Apparently, they're both married now, with 4 kids between them. The oldest just turned 18. He even tried to recount some of the few positive memories we shared, like my childhood birthdays or the time he drove to Lincoln to watch me play volleyball. Oddly enough, he mentioned how much of a hassle that trip was for him, so I'm not sure why he thought it counted as a happy memory. I figured this email was a fluke, maybe inspired by some fleeting guilt. But then another email arrived a few days later, and then another. Each one was similar: apologies, updates, and pleas to reconnect. Even Linda reached out, sending a message that shocked me: "We don't deserve forgiveness, but if you can find it in your heart to hear us out, it would mean the world to us." I shared all this with my Aunt Diane, my dad's sister. Diane has always been more of a mother figure to me than either of my biological moms. Her daughters, Jenny and Julie, are like sisters to me, and we're incredibly close. Diane's take? She thinks my dad's emails are out of character. She hasn't seen him in about a year but says he's always been self-absorbed and borderline narcissistic. She suggested I tread carefully if I even consider reconciling. After 4 months of this relentless email campaign, averaging one every 10 days, I finally caved. I sent a mass email to my dad, Linda, and my brothers. I told them their messages had moved me, but I was still skeptical. I needed time to process everything and figure out how to move forward. To their credit, they respected my wishes, replying with a simple, "Take your time." For a while, I wasn't sure how I felt. Then, last week at the hospital, I witnessed something that shook me. A colleague of mine was preparing for a kidney transplant for a patient in advanced renal failure. The donor was her sister, and everything was set. But at the last moment, the sister revealed she'd only gone through the process to humiliate her dying sibling. She said, "Now you'll die knowing I was the only one who could save you, and I chose not to." She even told their parents she planned to dump their ashes in a construction site toilet. The cruelty of it all horrified me. I realized I don't want to become someone so consumed by resentment that I'd revel in another's suffering. That's when I decided to give my family a chance to build the relationship I've always wished we had. It's a risk, but maybe it's worth taking. A few weeks ago, I shared how my family had unexpectedly reached out to reconcile after years of barely acknowledging my existence. For the first time in more than a decade, I decided to give them a chance. After exchanging some surprisingly thoughtful emails, I told them I was open to working through the past to try and build something meaningful for the future. They seemed genuinely eager, and we made plans to meet in person. Last week, I took a long weekend for the visit. Thankfully, I already have Fridays off, so it was just a matter of clearing my Monday schedule. I packed my bags, steeled my nerves, and headed back to Nebraska for the first time in years. I wasn't sure what to expect, but I wanted to approach it with an open mind. After all, they'd made the effort to reach out. It felt like I owed it to myself to see if there was a chance for something better. At first glance, everything seemed fine. In fact, it was better than fine. The grandkids greeted me like I was Santa Claus. They'd made little crafts and drawings for me, which was sweet. I spent time chatting with Lizzie, my oldest niece, who shares my love of volleyball. She's on her high school team, so we bonded over stories about practices, games, and the occasional bad ref call. My parents, brothers, and their wives were warm and engaged. They asked lots of questions about my life, what I'd been up to, what my job was like, even about my dating life. We went out to eat a few times and shared some laughs. Overall, it felt like a genuinely nice weekend. But beneath the surface, something felt off. I couldn't quite put my finger on it at the time, but as the weekend wore on, that uneasy feeling grew stronger. Looking back, it's the types of questions they asked and how our conversations often veered in a specific direction that really stood out. We'd start out talking about normal, mundane things, my brother Mike's newfound love of axe throwing, or how my dating life is going. But somehow, almost every conversation ended up circling back to money. They didn't outright ask me how much I make, but the hints were there. Questions like, "What's the most expensive surgery you've ever done?" or "What's the ballpark cost of a boob job?" At the time, I shrugged it off. After all, people are always curious about my line of work, and plastic surgery does tend to fascinate people. But now, I'm not so sure it was innocent curiosity. Another thing that stood out was how eager they were to go out to eat. I normally don't eat out much, I'm mindful of what I put into my body, but this felt like a mini vacation, so I didn't mind indulging a bit. The first night, my dad insisted on picking up the check, which felt like a nice gesture. I thought to myself, maybe this is their way of showing they're trying. But then came the second night. When the check arrived, there was a lot of awkward stalling and glances exchanged across the table. I waited for someone to step up, but when it became clear they were hoping I'd offer, I decided to grab the check myself. It wasn't a big deal, I can afford it, but the whole vibe felt a little strange. By the third night, I figured I'd take the lead and treat them all to dinner. It had been a pleasant enough visit, and I was feeling generous. I told them to pick a spot, thinking they'd choose something casual or moderately priced. Instead, they suggested one of the fanciest restaurants in Omaha. I hesitated but told myself it was fine, it's just one meal. I was imagining a typical dinner, entrees, maybe an appetizer or two, nothing extravagant. That's not how it went down. The moment we sat down, the orders started rolling in. Glasses of wine for everyone, multiple appetizers, it felt like they were taking full advantage of the opportunity. I watched in mild disbelief as the bill steadily climbed. The main courses were expensive but expected, so I didn't think too much about it. But then everyone decided to order dessert. Not just a shared slice of cake or two, but individual desserts for every single person at the table. By this point, I was starting to feel like I was being taken for a ride. And then came the kicker. As we were wrapping up, my dad casually suggested that my brother Liam order something to go for his daughter, Lucy. Lucy is 5 years old and wasn't even with us, she was at my parents' house spending the night. Liam jumped on the idea, saying, "Oh yeah, great idea. You don't mind, do you, Rachel?" Before I could even answer, he flagged down the waitress and ordered her the most expensive thing on the menu, surf and turf. A 14-ounce ribeye and 2 lobster tails, for a 5-year-old. By the time the check came, the total was astronomical. I paid it without saying a word, but inside, I was fuming. Not one person at that table thanked me for the dinner. Not a simple thank you, not even a nod of appreciation. I left the restaurant feeling like a complete fool. Since returning home, that dinner has been replaying in my mind over and over again. It's not just about the money, I can afford it, and that's not the issue. It's about the principle of it all. Their behavior throughout the trip, the subtle questions about my income, the way they eagerly took advantage of my offer to treat them, the lack of gratitude has me questioning everything. I can't help but wonder, am I looking for reasons to distrust them because of our history, or is my gut trying to tell me something important? Was this visit really about reconciling, or was it just a calculated attempt to get something out of me? The more I think about it, the more I feel like I might have been played. Yep, gut instinct wins again. It was all about what I could do for them. After my trip, my family doubled down on their so-called reconciliation effort with a flood of messages. They sent email after email about how great the visit had been, how much they enjoyed catching up, and how excited they were to do it all again soon. At first, I didn't know how to respond. Honestly, I wasn't even sure if there would be an again. My responses were polite but brief, even bordering on cold, not intentionally, but I was still reeling from that extravagant dinner fiasco and the nagging suspicion that their sudden interest in me wasn't entirely genuine. I thought that was the end of it, but oh, how wrong I was. The truth came out in the most unexpected way, through Lizzie. One afternoon, I got an email from her thanking me. At first, I was pleasantly surprised, thinking maybe she was just a kind-hearted kid reaching out. But as I read on, my stomach dropped. In the email, Lizzie thanked me for gifting her a boob job as her graduation present. I stared at the screen, stunned. What the hell was she talking about? I hadn't promised her, or anyone, a free surgery. I immediately wrote back, trying to clarify. I asked her what she meant and where she got the idea that I was giving her this surgery as a gift. She responded quickly, saying that her parents had told her I'd agreed to give her implants as her high school graduation present. Apparently, this was something she had requested because her parents wanted to get her a big gift to celebrate her graduation. While I've heard of parents gifting cosmetic procedures, it's typically for college graduation, not high school. The idea of giving a barely 18-year-old girl implants for finishing high school made me uneasy. Lizzie explained that she had small breasts and was self-conscious about it, especially since she was very active in sports and had a more athletic build. I told her that her body would likely change naturally after high school as she became less physically active, a common phenomenon that I'd seen in myself and many of my friends. But she was adamant, saying this was something she really wanted. At that point, I stopped the conversation with Lizzie. I didn't want her caught in the middle of something that clearly wasn't her doing. Instead, I reached out to her parents, my brother Barry, his wife Brianne, and my other brother Larry and his wife Cassie, and my parents to figure out what was going on. I created a group chat and asked point-blank what was happening. They didn't even bother denying it. They admitted that they wanted to get Lizzie the implants as her graduation gift but couldn't afford it. They confessed that this was part of the reason they'd reached out to me in the first place. Of course, they insisted over and over that reconnecting with me wasn't just about getting a free boob job. But their words rang hollow. Despite their denials, it was clear to me what this was all about. When I told them I wasn't comfortable performing the procedure, they started in on the guilt trips. It started subtly, with comments like how much they'd heard about my stellar reviews and how safe they'd feel if family did the surgery. When that didn't sway me, they began outright guilting me. "We were really hoping you'd help us out. It's not just for Lizzie, it's for the family." The manipulation tactics were painfully familiar, like echoes from my childhood. But I'm not that same naive kid anymore. I'm 34 years old, and I've spent years learning to set boundaries and recognize unhealthy behavior. I didn't cave. I told them I wasn't sure I could do the surgery and stood firm. But they didn't let up. The guilt trips escalated into passive-aggressive remarks. When I reminded them that they claimed this wasn't about getting free surgery, they completely ignored my point. Instead, they doubled down, insisting I was being unreasonable. My dad even got involved, sending me a long-winded message about how family should help family. But one line in his message absolutely enraged me. "Don't you think you owe it to the family to make this as affordable as possible, considering all we did for you?" All they did for me? I couldn't even process that line without laughing bitterly. These people had done the bare minimum for me growing up, if that. They'd ignored me, dismissed me, and abandoned me when I needed them most. What exactly did they think they had done for me that I now owed them anything? I didn't respond right away. I was too angry. Instead, I called Dagny, my closest friend and my sounding board for situations like this. Talking to her helped me calm down and even find a petty edge of humor in the situation. She reminded me of a story she'd read about a woman who went through all the steps of being a kidney donor for her sister, only to back out at the last minute to make a statement. While I wasn't about to take it that far, I did find some inspiration in the idea of standing my ground unapologetically. Finally, I messaged my dad and said I'd do the surgery but under my terms. He softened immediately, though he couldn't resist adding, "I knew you'd come around." I told them to pick a weekend, and I'd come in on an unusual Friday, my usual day off, to perform the procedure. They agreed but started complaining almost immediately. They balked at the idea of staying in a hotel for 3 days, insisting they stay at my place instead. I refused, explaining that my 2-bedroom townhouse didn't have the space. They scoffed at that, but I didn't budge. When they arrived, I insisted on a meeting to sign all the necessary paperwork. I'd sent them the forms ahead of time, but unsurprisingly, they hadn't bothered to read them. I made sure my dad and Larry signed everything alongside Lizzie. They thought it was odd that I was including my dad, but I brushed it off as a special gesture for making amends. In reality, I was covering my bases. Lizzie's forms gave her consent as an adult, but my dad and Larry were signing the financial paperwork. The surgery went smoothly. It was a routine procedure, and Lizzie was a model patient. She thanked me afterward, something no one else in the family bothered to do. They headed back to Nebraska the next day, and I thought that was the end of it. For weeks later, they got the bill, $12,000. And the calls and messages started pouring in. Apparently, they'd assumed the surgery would be completely free or heavily discounted. I don't know where they got that idea, especially since the financial paperwork they signed explicitly outlined the costs. I sent back one message: I have no idea what would make you think that. I only do pro bono work for family. And then I blocked them. I'm done. Truly, finally, done. I've spent my life chasing scraps of approval from people who never truly cared about me. No family is better than a toxic family. I still have my aunt and cousins, who've been more like family to me than my parents and brothers ever were. And maybe one day, I'll get married and start a family of my own. But for now, I'll keep living the life I built for myself, by myself, without them.